Swimming in the ocean has been popular throughout history for its proven physical, mental, and spiritual benefits. Seawater helps to relax your muscles, improves your mood, and cleanses your aura, leading to an all-around better quality of life. Although the pastime is popular across the generations, the older a person gets, then the more benefits they will receive from swimming in the sea. As a result, lots of elderly people will swim every day to improve their flexibility, especially if they live near the ocean. In most places of the world, there would be little risk associated with the hobby, aside from the occasional friendly fish encounter. But as most people know, the Australian waters are home to some of the world's most venomous fish, as well as the most dangerous sharks. Even if you know the area well, and you've visited the same beach thousands of times before, you never know when your luck will run out in Australian waters. 63-year-old Christine Armstrong was in a good mood. Not that she was ever in a particularly bad mood. She had just returned home after her holiday in New Zealand, where she had been able to explore the country and relax. Although she had a good time, she always loved her day-to-day life and was happy to return and get back into her normal routine. Among other things, her favorite part of her day was her daily swim in the sea in Tathra. She lived very close to the ocean, something that she had carefully planned with her husband when they moved there, as she was an avid swimmer and ocean enthusiast. She had been coming to the same spot every morning for the last 14 years, so she knew the area better than most. She preferred to swim alone, but was always happy when people wanted to come with her, especially her husband, Rob Armstrong. Rob had lived in Tathra for 60 years and had watched as the area had gradually become overrun with sharks. Although they used to be hunted by local fishermen, this practice had been banned in the 90s, leading to a population increase. He had always worried about his wife swimming there, but she had never reported seeing any sharks while she was out, so he thought that maybe he was overreacting. He would soon come to realize just how right he was, in the worst way possible. On April 3, 2014, Christine and her husband went to their usual swimming area with a couple of friends, ready to swim the 250-meter circuit that they regularly swam. Chatting as they approached the beach, Christine was telling them all about her trip to New Zealand, while they listened intently to her every word. She was happy to have such close friends, and as they began to swim out, she felt at peace now that she was back home again. After they got a little way out to sea, Christine changed her mind about the morning swim. Her body was aching from the flight the day before, so she decided to head back to shore instead, leaving her husband and her friends to complete the circuit alone. Telling everyone that she would meet them back on shore, she began to head back. They had already made it quite far out from shore, but she was confident that she would make it back without a problem. As she swam, she admired her surroundings and watched as her friends disappeared from sight. She was sad about not being able to complete her daily swim, but was sure that her body would feel better tomorrow. What she didn't know is that she was being stalked by a huge shark beneath her, which was watching her movements and readying itself for the attack. It had been attracted to the area by the smell of a rotting shark corpse nearby, but was more than happy to hunt for easy prey. Unfortunately, today would not be Christine's lucky day, and before she even knew what had happened to her, she was silently pulled beneath the waves by the massive shark as the animal swallowed her whole. The rest of the group had no idea what had happened and were still completing their circuits, thinking that Christine would be waiting for them on the shore when they got back. Once they were finished, they started racing back to shore, but Rob had a bad feeling as they rounded the bay. Scanning the water, he suddenly spotted a large dark mound in the water and immediately identified it as a large bronze whaler shark. With birds circling, he knew that the shark had caught something, and they would have to be careful not to attract its attention. He saw his friends heading straight for it, as they clearly hadn't spotted it yet. He began shouting out to them to stop and turn around. He caught up to them before they swam straight into it, and decided that the best way to avoid an attack would be to form a barrier together. They knew that if the shark were to attack, it would go for a singular victim. If they stuck together in a chain, the shark was less likely to attack. Luckily, this worked, and they were able to escape unharmed. As they laughed with each other about what a close call that was, Rob realized that someone was missing, his wife. He was expecting her to greet them on the shore, but she was nowhere to be seen. He began to panic and started to ask people on the beach if they had seen her leave the water, to which they replied no. No one had come out of the water except them. They started to search the areas that she could have gone, as maybe the beachgoers had missed her when she left the sea. They checked the changing rooms and the car, but she wasn't there. So they decided to head back into the water to see if they could see her. They hoped that she had maybe continued swimming by herself in a different part of the ocean and just hadn't come in yet, or had left the water on a different beach. But as time passed, they began to realize that this was more and more unlikely. Afraid to swim into the water, after seeing the large whaler shark, they took a boat out and started their search. While calling out her name as they went along, they suddenly found clear evidence that they would never see Christine again. Human remains. There was not much left, but by the amount of blood that was staining the water, they knew that she must have died. Realizing the worst had happened, Rob called for the emergency services, stating that there had been a shark attack. They arrived quickly and began to scan the waters, where, among the blood and carnage, they were able to retrieve the swim cap and goggles belonging to Christine. Rob was devastated. It was never determined what species of shark was responsible for Christine's death. Although there was the large whaler shark seen by the swimmers, it was thought that a great white shark would be more likely due to the expected size of the animal. It was suspected that Christine was killed instantly, swallowed whole by the animal, something a whaler shark would have had a hard time doing. The authorities stated that they wouldn't search for the shark responsible and instead focused on educating people about the dangers of the beach. More and more illegal fishermen had been visiting the area in the last few years and would place bait to attract the animals. They began to increase their watch in the bay to ensure that this practice would stop in order to save more lives in the future. Although horrified by the death of his wife, Rob was relatively optimistic about the last moments of her life, stating that she must have been nearly instantly killed, as the shark that he had spotted had been so large. He and others in the group that day estimate the shark they saw to be around 6 meters long, making it double the size of even the largest bronze whaler shark. With very little remaining of Christine, it was assumed that the animal must have swallowed her almost entirely, leaving nothing for her family to find besides her goggles and cap. Although Rob was depressed after Christine died, and it was difficult for him, he continued living his life as much as he could. He still swims with the same group to this very day, despite the horrible memory of witnessing his wife's terrifying final affliction.
One of La Jolla's most well-known tourist destinations is La Jolla Cove, a small cove surrounded by high rocky cliffs. It has become an excellent location for scuba diving, swimming, and snorkeling thanks to its wealth of marine life and colder, crystal-clear water. Additionally, the water visibility here can sometimes exceed 30 feet, enticing divers to gather from all corners of Southern California. Large and powerful swells from the open ocean can occasionally come in. At high tides, there is only a tiny patch of dry sand on the beach, but the cove's tide pools are exposed at shallow tides. But amidst the popularity and beauty of the cove lay a dark past. In June 1959, one of the most horrific shark attacks in San Diego, California, occurred in Alligator Head, just a short ways off of La Jolla Cove. It was June 14, 1959. While most people were happy to sleep the day off, Robert Pamperin was awake early on a Sunday. Peeking through his windows, he noticed that the weather was slightly not in his favor. It was a bad day to be in the ocean. However, Robert and his friend Gerard had planned for this day for quite a while. They were planning on hunting for abalone later in the day. Abalones are huge marine gastropod mollusks. The chilly waters of New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Japan, and the west coast of North America are where the huge sea snail is most frequently observed. Abalones are regarded for their exquisite meat and extraordinarily deep flavor, making them a culinary delicacy. It is one of the most expensive types of seafood available, and it can be sold at a high price, either canned, frozen, or live in the shell. Robert and Gerard were hoping to sell some of their catch for a reasonable price, knowing there was a thriving abalone population in the deeper parts of Alligator Head. However, abalones are typically nocturnal animals. They like staying away from lit areas by hiding in the dark during the daytime and feeding at night. This means Robert and Gerard had to go through with the hunting later in the day. To help fill the time in the afternoon, the two friends decided to take their girlfriends to the beach. The plan was while the girls were sunbathing at the shore, Robert and Gerard would leave to hunt at Alligator Head. Robert prepared for the day like any other. He made breakfast and listened to the news, not realizing that today's calm, cloudy day would take a nightmarish turn. Hunting abalone is actually quite taxing to the body, as it requires a lot of movement, so Robert would be free diving later on. He prepared minimal equipment: a pair of blue swim fins, a pink bathing suit, a black mask, black diving gloves, and a yellow-handled abalone iron, a tool used to extract abalone from rocks without harming them. He also brought with him a black inner tube with an attached burlap sack. After Robert and his girlfriend finished preparing everything, they got into their car and made their way to the beach at La Jolla Cove. The sun was still overcast, but every now and again it would peek through the clouds. The outing could have been easily canceled, but there was no stopping Robert and Gerard. Arriving at the beach, Robert parked his car and met with Gerard and his girlfriend. The two shook hands and shared laughs. They talked about the weather and, of course, the hunt later. Meanwhile, their girlfriends caught up with one another. The four headed straight for the beach and spent time like they normally would. They had a front row seat for the beautiful San Diego ocean after all. Who wouldn't want to enjoy a nice, relaxing Sunday like this? Around 5 p.m., Robert and Gerard gathered their equipment from their parked vehicles and headed towards Alligator Head. The weather was still overcast, and the two men could only see through 7 meters of water underneath them. Not exactly an ideal day for hunting abalone. However, it was time to dive into the water. The two men donned their masks, fins, and gloves. They headed straight for the water. The men were experienced swimmers and divers, so they were trained well enough to understand the risks of entering the ocean. Being an engineer for Convair, an aircraft manufacturer, Robert was nobody's fool. However, what probably gave them confidence was the history of the area. There had been no fatal shark attacks in this area before. In the eyes of the public, it was a safe diving spot. However, that would all soon change. The two men took deep breaths and went into the depths. Swimming slowly across the water, they scanned the area for wild abalone hiding in the crevices and surfaces of rocks at the bottom. Spotting a couple of abalones a few meters down, the two men quickly dove deeper. With one hand holding the iron and the other holding the burlap sack, the two carefully scraped the shelled creatures from their attachments. They were careful not to damage the shells, but they had to do things quickly. After all, there was no air tank to save them from drowning. After gathering a few abalones, the men surfaced and took in a breath of fresh air. Fate must have had other plans that day, because for some reason, the two became separated by the waves. Slowly but surely, Robert and Gerard drifted apart until there were 10 to 15 meters between them. Suddenly, a great white shark appeared underneath Robert, swinging its formidable head back and forth. It was sizing up Robert, thinking it was one of its prey. And then it happened. The shark went in for the kill, and the water exploded into chaos. Opening its massive jaws, the creature was able to devour Robert's entire lower body, forcing him unnaturally higher out of the surface. Robert screamed desperately, "Help me!" Gerard quickly whipped in the direction of his friend. He saw Robert in distress but thought he might be having a cramp. Nevertheless, Gerard rushed to his friend's aid. However, something was not right. Gerard noticed that Robert suddenly disappeared into the waters, leaving behind a crimson mist of blood. Startled and in complete disbelief, Gerard plunged deeper into the water to really see what was happening to Robert. And there it was, in plain and perfect view, a large great white shark completely devouring Robert's lower body. Gerard estimated the creature to be around 7 meters in length. Robert thrashed wildly, trying to free himself from the marauding beast. However, it was to no avail. The shark's power overwhelmed him, and it quickly took him to deep waters. Gerard took a deep breath and quickly rushed towards the commotion, waving his hands frantically at the shark in an attempt to scare it away. However, it was to no avail. The shark's jaws were clamped shut on Robert's lower body, his legs inside the creature's jaws. Suddenly, The massive shark began swinging its head from side to side, trying to tear Robert in half. Realizing he wasn't doing anything to the creature, Gerard swam back to the shore, alerting the lifeguards, who then alerted the local authorities of the attack. Immediately after Robert's attack, 10 experienced scuba divers dove into the area, searching for Robert. However, after combing the waters for 2 hours, they ended up with nothing, not even Robert's clothing or gear. However, a few days later, a swim fin marked with rows of shark teeth washed ashore on the La Jolla beach. Upon inspection, authorities discovered the written initials of Robert. In the subsequent investigations, people were skeptical of Gerard. However, his statement was supported by William Abbott, who was atop a rock formation when the attack happened. His testimony was congruent with Gerard's. However, people were still skeptical that it was a great white shark that attacked Robert. They wanted to believe it was a killer whale, but Gerard was sure he saw a great white. Investigations revealed 4 crucial events happening beforehand that may have contributed to Robert's gruesome fate. Firstly, divers were spearing yellowtail less than 2 hours before the attack. Sharks are reported to be attracted to speared fish and the low-frequency vibrations of the commotion. Secondly, hours before the attack, a U.S. Navy sailor had badly lacerated himself in the adjacent rocks. Consequently, he lost a lot of blood while he was in the water, further attracting the shark into the area. Thirdly, approximately 600 meters to the west of the cove were a group of harbor seals perched by the rocks. The fourth reason is probably the most contributory to the attack. The night before the attack, a dead whale washed 800 meters ashore to the north of where Robert was attacked. This may have drawn unwanted attention from the shark, ultimately causing the gruesome fate of Robert. It was undoubtedly a tragedy what happened to Robert. We can all agree, whether you're an experienced diver or swimmer, things outside of your control can directly influence your time in the ocean. You should always keep in mind that when you enter the water, you're entering the beast's territory. You're at their mercy, and growing up to 7 meters in length, it could easily swallow you whole. Even in the waters with no previous shark fatalities, without taking the proper precautions, you could easily end up as the first shark attack victim to meet their unfortunate final affliction.
Although there are currently more than 1,000 different shark species, one extinct species has captured the world's attention since its discovery in 1835, the megalodon. Thought to be nearly 20 meters long, it would have been 3 times the size of the modern great white shark and would have dominated the seas before it died out 2.6 million years ago. Despite the species never being seen outside of fossilized remains, the prehistoric shark has become somewhat of an urban legend in recent years, as people debate whether it evaded extinction and now lives out at sea somewhere. Most dispel this as a myth. But what happens when a shark is spotted that's as big as a minibus? Although not a megalodon, a creature of that size living in our oceans is a terrifying thought. You might think, surely something like that can't exist outside the realms of the imagination, but you would be wrong, as Lloyd Skinner discovered when he found himself face to face with a dinosaur-esque predator. 37-year-old Lloyd Skinner was visiting South Africa for a month after finishing a stretch within a mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. After a few hard months underground, rarely seeing the sun and putting his body through hell, he was excited for his holiday. He was planning to be in the country for a month before he headed to the United Kingdom for his next adventure, but he would never make it out of South Africa. On January 12, 2010, Lloyd decided he would spend the day in False Bay at Fishhook, which was home to a small but beautiful bay. Although the waves could be rough and there were a large number of sharks known to be in the area, he decided that today would be the day that he would go swimming. He loved to swim in the warm southern waters and prepared his trunks and goggles so he could make the most of his time in the water. Sadly, those goggles would turn out to be the cause of his savage death. As Lloyd and girlfriend Deborah arrived at the beach, they were disappointed by the weather, as it had become colder and cloudier since the morning. Now it was about midday and they had just arrived, but Lloyd was still determined to go swimming, regardless of how the weather would turn out. Deborah decided she would stay on the shore and sunbathe, meaning that Lloyd could safely leave all of his things with her without having to worry. With his mind unburdened, he headed into the water and began to swim out to sea. There were quite a few other people in the water, and he briefly acknowledged them as he passed by, but ultimately wanted to swim alone. He continued to swim until he was about 100 meters from shore, but it was still pretty shallow. He stood in the ocean with the water coming up to his chest, so he didn't consider himself to be particularly far out to sea. He could see the other swimmers in the distance, but was grateful for the space alone, and quickly began to swim back and forth in what felt like his own private pool. After some time, Lloyd noticed his goggles were filling with some water, so he stopped to readjust them. Although the water was only to his chest, he couldn't see the seafloor. The waves were kicking up the sand so much that the water was dark and murky. He thought nothing of it, but little did he know that something was watching his legs from the depths. Lloyd put his goggles back on just in time as he was dragged under the waves. He had been tossed around for a few seconds under the water before he even realized what was happening. He had been attacked by a shark, and now his legs were bleeding profusely. Panicking, he began to shout for help and managed to get the attention of some people on shore as he waved and screamed that a shark had bitten him. There was a mixed reaction from those further into shore. Some began to swim out to his aid, while others swam away in a panic, hoping that if they reached the sand in time, then they wouldn't be the next victim of the massive fish. He felt a wave of relief as he saw his rescuers make their way towards him, but he had underestimated how far out to sea he was and how long it would take for help to arrive. As he tried to swim towards them, he was suddenly pulled underwater again. Lloyd felt sharp teeth sink deep into his abdomen as he screamed in agony. If there was any hope for him before, it was gone now. He turned to face his attacker through his goggles and was shocked at the sheer size of the animal before him. The animal's head dwarfed him, proving to him just how easily the shark could overpower him. The massive animal continued to bite down on his torso and shook him violently, determined that Lloyd would be its next meal. His vision was beginning to cloud, both from blood loss and the fact that the ocean was now a deep red color as the shark continued to rip him apart. For just a second, the shark let go of his body and he floated to the surface, barely fighting to keep his head above water to take his last breath. He could hear faint screams from the shore as people spotted his mangled body in the distance and could only imagine the horror that his girlfriend was feeling as she helplessly watched him bleed to death so far out to sea. With one last desperate look to shore, Lloyd was pulled below the water for the last time, where the shark took him far out to sea and devoured the poor man. The witnesses on the beach couldn't believe what they had just seen. One minute, everything was calm and serene, and the next, blood was pouring into the ocean, and they couldn't seem to figure out why. When they heard Lloyd screaming for help, they realized what had happened and panicked. From the safety of the shoreline, they watched in horror as the shark came back again and again, ripping into the man as he struggled to escape before it finally ripped him apart and dragged him out to sea. They were terrified by the size. It was at least 14 feet long, about the size of a minibus, which made Lloyd look like a doll in comparison as he was thrown around by the huge animal. It was a horrifying thing to see, but even as the rescuers got to the scene, they couldn't see any sign of him except for the massive amount of blood that had stained the ocean. They called for the emergency services, who began to search the ocean with 4 rescue boats and a helicopter, but they knew that there was no hope of finding Lloyd alive, judging from the descriptions that the witnesses had given. They were hopeful that they would be able to at least recover some body parts so that the family would have something to bury, but they couldn't find anything. The shark had devoured the man whole and left nothing behind. The locals began to worry as these shark attacks were becoming more and more common. A shark expert was consulted, and they determined that it was most likely a great white shark that had killed Lloyd Skinner due to its massive size and unique hunting style. A large shark had been spotted in the area just a few hours before the attack, but the shark flag was not raised to alert the people on the beach. Everyone on the beach that day continued to swim, without any worry at all about sharks. If they had raised the flag when they first saw the shark, maybe this even could have been avoided, but unfortunately, it cost a man his life. There have been lots of discussions since then to figure out how to avoid these attacks, but most have been deemed too impractical or expensive to yield any worthwhile results. Some of these ideas included sonar buoys that could alert the lifeguards to the presence of a shark, or even some talk of an electrified system to send a shock to any approaching sharks before they had the opportunity to get too close. Until a method that will prevent all sharks from entering the waters around the beaches, these brutal attacks will continue. The great white sharks around the coast of South Africa will always be lurking, waiting for its next meal, bringing another innocent person to their terrifying final affliction. On Saturday, 13th of May, 2023, surfers headed into the Great Australian Bight, a large natural bay located on the South Australian coastline. This bay, an important camping ground for southern right whales, offers some fantastic places to surf. The dramatic coastline creates incredible beaches, enticing people far and wide to enjoy swimming, snorkeling, fishing, and surfing. Simon drove about 7 kilometers north from his hometown of Elliston on the Eyre Peninsula. His destination was Walker's Rocks Beach. This is one of the longest beaches on South Australia's west coast and is partially sheltered by surrounding reefs, appealing to both swimmers and surfers. On this particular day, fellow surfers included 22-year-old Jaden Miller and a 13-year-old student who attended Mr. Baccanello's school. There were more than a dozen surfers enjoying the waves that morning. Some reported 20 people in the water at the time. There was a certain camaraderie among the surfers. They were riding the waves together, each of them drawn to the sea and the promise of an enjoyable time. Simon was less than 50 meters from shore when he started to shout. He must have noticed something in the water as he began to warn others to get out of the water. Locals knew the area was popular with great white sharks. In fact, the surfing spot was nestled between Venus Bay and East Island, two well-documented shark reproductive zones. Simon shouted at his fellow surfers. It is unclear whether he had been bitten by the shark at this point or whether he had seen an ominous shadow beneath the waves. Perhaps a dorsal fin had broken through the surface of the water before disappearing below the waves as it came in for the kill. Whatever it was, Simon warned the other surfers to get out of the water. He shouted that there was a shark. Between 15 and 20 people heard the urgency in his voice. They turned to look at the man. Had they heard him correctly? He shouted again, urging them to swim away from him. He was at the back of the group, furthest from the shore, furthest from the safety of dry land. And as the shark came in for the attack, Simon continued to warn those around him. Then, all of a sudden, a commotion erupted around the teacher. As people made a dash for the shore, Mr. Baccanello disappeared from sight. As surfing youngster Jaden Miller paddled away on his board, he glanced back over his shoulder. He saw the horror unfolding, a shark thrashing around where Simon had been just moments before. The water bubbled and boiled, a huge commotion as the shark grabbed hold of Simon and dragged him underwater. Out of sight, fellow surfers could just see Simon's board, tombstoning, a description used by surfers to describe a surfboard that is standing upright above the water. As the surfer is pulled underwater, the cord attached to their ankle is pulled tight, tugging the surfboard onto its end. Witnesses knew Simon was directly beneath the surfboard at that point. They knew that he would have been fighting to get to the surface, but something was dragging him down. Something was holding him underwater, but there was nothing anyone could do. It all happened so fast. Someone on the shoreline tooted a horn, a warning of a shark attack, telling everyone to get in, get out of the water. There was a mad rush for the beach. Everyone was paddling furiously to get to safety. Panic gripped the surfers and swimmers. Up to 20 people were in the water at the time of the attack. Any one of them could have been taken. Any one of them attacked. And that's something they will likely think about for a very long time. Just how close they came to being attacked. As surfer Jaden made it to shore, he shouted for someone to call an ambulance, but it was too late. They knew there was little hope for Simon. He had been underwater too long now. He hadn't resurfaced, and the shark had now vanished. Emergency services rushed to the scene and arrived just after 10 a.m. From eyewitness accounts, it is thought that Simon was attacked 3 times by the shark. Perhaps firstly when he shouted for everyone to get out of the water, then when the surfboard tombstoned, and thirdly when other surfers saw the thrashing of a shark breaking through the surface of the water where Simon had been. The repeated attacks led some people to believe that it had been multiple sharks tearing into Simon, maybe a feeding frenzy, but this has not been verified. If it was a single shark, then it was a very unusual behavior for a shark. Typically, they take one bite before realizing humans aren't typical prey and swim away. If they are in hunting mode, then they often bite a seal or sea lion once before swimming away a little distance. They wait for the animal to grow weaker before going in for a second bite. As seals can deliver damaging bites, the sharks use this tactic to try to avoid being injured. Perhaps this shark was actively hunting Simon. It wasn't deterred by the fact that it was different prey from usual. Could it have been a case of mistaken identity, as is often claimed to be the case in shark attacks? Or was there another explanation for the multiple attacks? Experts have offered their opinions, but sometimes there is no rhyme or reason for a shark attack. Sometimes it can't be explained, and there is absolutely nothing the victim could have done differently to have changed the outcome. An extensive search was mounted following the attack. Boats and helicopters scoured the seas, searching the water around the attack site, but nothing was left. There was no trace of Simon. His board was recovered, a single bite mark in its center. One piece of styrofoam floated on the sea, thought to be part of the board. Later, a small strip of wetsuit washed ashore, but that was it. As the search for Simon continued, it moved to the shoreline. Searchers were hoping to find something that could verify what happened, some evidence that could be analyzed. Volunteers and rescue teams joined in the search to look for any trace of the much-missed young teacher. More than 10 days had passed after the attack, and there was still no sign of him. Simon was described as someone who always put others before himself, someone who had a beautiful nature and saw the best in everyone. Simon Baccanello will be sorely missed by all those who knew him. He leaves a hole in many people's hearts. He had only moved to the area in January, 4 months before the attack. It was an exciting new opportunity for him, a new challenge that he relished. He taught math, science, and health and physical education at Elliston Area School. Pupils referred to him affectionately as Mr. B. He was popular amongst staff and students, a dedicated teacher and enthusiastic person who put others first. He had coached students on both the football and tennis teams, as well as in junior sports. Chad Fleming, the school principal, described the 46-year-old as one of a kind and a true champion. He said that although he had only known Simon for 5 months, he felt like they had been friends for 10 years. That was the impact Mr. Baccanello had on people. Simon had loved living in the area, a place where he could enjoy both fishing and surfing, close to his home and place of work. In the short time that he had lived there, he had become part of the close community. With no sign of Simon's body almost 2 weeks later, his family and friends made the painful decision to hold a funeral service in celebration of his life 12 days after the attack. A private vigil was held at the beach where Simon was attacked, a chance to remember the much-loved man and pay respects from the tight-knit community. His family said that they will have to get used to the fact that Simon may be lost to the sea forever. A watery grave, his final resting place after his tragic, final affliction. It was the weekend, Sunday, September 8, 1991. Jonathan Lee was a 19-year-old second-year student at Adelaide University in South Australia. He was from the northeastern suburb of One Tree Hill. He and his mates enjoyed their weekends off from studying. It meant they could explore the surrounding area. have a break from lectures, and take a boat out into the sea to enjoy a spot of diving. This was the perfect way to spend their time off. They drove to Aldinga Beach, 45 kilometers south of Adelaide. From there, they hauled their dive gear into a boat and motored out from shore. The sky was clear, the air was warm. The group of friends laughed and chatted as the sea breeze blew their hair and the salt spray splashed into their faces. They were heading 350 meters offshore to a well-known dive spot simply called the Drop-Off. The golden sands at Aldinga Beach gave way to intertidal rock flats that extended offshore as a reef. Here, the depth dropped into an inky blue. Colorful fish swam amongst beautiful corals. Sea stars and sea urchins clung to the rocks. Groupers lurked below the overhangs and hid in the dark caves. Snappers swam past in their shoals, heading to their breeding grounds. Each snapper can grow up to 1.3 meters, or 4 feet in length, and weigh 20 kilograms, or 44 pounds. They were easy prey for sharks. Where there were snappers, there were likely to be great white sharks in hot pursuit. When the group spotted the sea turn from a light blue to a deep, dark color, they knew they had reached the edge of the reef. They lowered the anchor, and each diver pulled their mask over their face, checked their regulator, and rolled off the side of the boat. Bubbles escaped from Jonathan's wetsuit as he submerged below the surface. The cool seawater engulfed him as he sank lower in the water column. The group of friends spread out as they each explored the reef. It was a beautiful underwater scene, the brightly colored fish flitting this way and that, a green sea turtle nibbling at sea lettuce growing from the side of the reef. Beyond the drop-off was the eerie blue expanse of the open ocean. But something nearby was on the hunt. A great white shark was drawn to the reef to prey on the fish. They were easy prey and abundant closer to shore. On this particular day, despite the perfect conditions above the water, the sea was murky. Silt and sediment had been churned up from the sea floor, making visibility relatively poor. 20 minutes into the dive, 4 of the friends headed back to the boat. They had seen enough. It had been a refreshing dip, and now they climbed out of the sea and sat on the boat, pulling off their dive gear. They patiently waited for the rest of the team to finish their dive. The remaining members of the group continued to view the amazing underwater wildlife. One of the more senior divers in the team was 30-year-old Dave Roberts. Not much later, he too decided to head for the boat. But as he began to swim back, he noticed something. It was a large, colorful rock that caught his eye. He swam down to take a closer look, and that's when he witnessed the shark attack. He didn't see it at first. Instead, what had caught his attention was a strange sound. It was like a booming of thunder, an ominous rumble. He looked upwards at the light penetrating the sea surface. Was it a boat powering through the water above them? The sound of its engine roaring and vibrating through the water column? That's what it sounded like. But when Dave looked up, he didn't see any sign of a boat. He looked below him, near the bottom of the reef. That's when he saw it. He saw an enormous great white shark. It was thrashing its head from side to side near the sea bottom, likely eating a grouper or a snapper. As its whole body arced and crashed, its tail whipped up sand from the seabed. A cloud of sand and silt surrounded the shark, obscuring Dave's view. He watched, fascinated by the attack. His heart thundered in his chest as he witnessed a top predator furiously on the hunt, just meters from where he swam. Then the cloud of silt and sand turned red as blood filled the surrounding water. This was no attack on a fish. This was something much larger. With his heart in his mouth, Dave suddenly realized this could be one of the team. He was filled with a sense of dread, a terrible feeling that he was witnessing one of his friends being mauled to death right before his eyes. But there was nothing he could do. He had no weapon. He had no way of distracting the shark or diverting its attention. He took a defensive position. There was no way he was going to swim back to the boat now. The most dangerous time of any dive is when the diver resurfaces. That's when they're at their most vulnerable. That's when most shark attacks happen. The shark was in full attack mode. and all Dave could do was hide. He crouched down behind the large, colorful rock he had swum down to inspect in the first place. Hardly daring to breathe, he peered over the top of the rock, clinging onto its side with his gloved hands. Then the shark turned towards Dave. He crouched down further. The bubbles escaped from his mouthpiece, a giveaway to his position. He held his breath. Then he saw a sight that shook him to his core. Inside the shark's mouth was Jonathan, his dive buddy. Jonathan's body was limp and lifeless as the shark swam powerfully past Dave. He could see its eyes, dark black. It didn't look at him. It already had its catch. It stared, unblinking ahead as it passed within 2 feet of Dave. If he had stretched out his arm, he would have been able to touch it. Dave needed to get to the surface. He needed to warn the others and check that everyone else was okay. When the shark was out of sight, he made a dash for the surface. He propelled himself upwards with his flippers. His legs ached as he kicked furiously, the lactic acid building up, the burning sensation growing until finally he burst through the water into the warm air above. He pulled out his regulator. "Shark! Shark!" he screamed at the dive boat. The 4 friends already on board leapt into action. 18-year-old Ben Peterson hauled up the anchor and immediately motored over to Dave. Leaning over the side of the boat, the friends pulled him on board. As they did so, they noticed something floating in the water. Then something else, and something else. It was a dive fin, an oxygen tank, and some torn wetsuit. The tank was undamaged, not a sign of a scratch or a dent, but the air hose had been severed right by the regulator. In stunned silence, the 5 of them stared in disbelief for a few heartbreaking seconds at the equipment bobbing through the sea. The 3 remaining members of the group had also witnessed the attack. Just like Dave, they had taken a defensive position during the attack. They had seen the shark on top of Jonathan. It was as though it had pinned him to the floor as it bit into him, shaking him violently from side to side. When it was over, they too made a mad dash for the boat. The group quickly pulled themselves into the boat, breathless, shocked, and stunned. It could have been any one of them. They were lucky to be alive. They grabbed a flare and fired it into the air to signal for help. There was no sign of Jonathan now. He had been taken into the depths. The group searched the sea from the safety of the boat. They hoped that by some miracle Jonathan would pop up to the surface, having survived the terrible attack. But it wasn't to be. Sadly, Jonathan was never seen again. When the group made it back to dry land, they called the authorities. An extensive search was conducted to try and find any trace of the young student. Apart from a few body tissues found floating in the sea near the site of the attack, nothing was ever found. The only thing left of Jonathan was the horrifying story of his final affliction. Geoffrey had been introduced to the ocean at a young age. Since before he could walk, his parents would take him on boats, and from then he always had a deep affinity for the ocean and a deep respect for all things in it. When he was growing up, his passions were surfing, diving, and sailing, but he wasn't sure how he could make a living from any of those. Then, Matrix Ocean Adventures were hiring crew for their new catamaran, and Geoffrey jumped at the opportunity. He applied to work on board the luxury vessel and was accepted as a first mate. His dream of turning his passions into a living had come true. Very quickly, he was informed that the skipper had pulled out of the job and was asked if he would like to step up into that role. Geoffrey was delighted. Although he was brimming with pride, Geoffrey was very modest about his new job and took to it all in his stride. Matrix Ocean Adventures had just launched their new vessel, Matrix, a 24-meter catamaran that slept up to 12 passengers in 6 private cabins. It was one of the most luxurious sailing vessels chartering Australia's western coastline. Geoffrey and his crewmates were excited to be skippering the vessel on its maiden voyage. The adventure began in the south in Western Australia's capital, Perth. From there, they sailed northwards towards the tourist town of Broome. It was a cruise that would take 13 days and nights. Along the way, They moored up in small bays and inlets, swimming from the boat and snorkeling in the crystal-clear waters. It was the trip of a lifetime for Geoffrey's customers, and he knew the best places to visit to take full advantage of the trip. When they were only a third of the way into the voyage and just off the coast of Geraldton, Geoffrey and his crew meandered the boat through the Abrojos Islands. They headed to the southeast corner of Pelsiart Island and dropped the anchor at Wreck Point. It was around 2 p.m. They had all finished up lunch and were ready for some swimming. The chain of islands offers fantastic snorkeling and diving experiences. The coral reefs host a plethora of marine flora and fauna. The brightly colored fish, playful sea lions, and, of course, sharks are all regular sightings. As the anchor splashed into the water and its heavy metal chain fed out into the depths, Geoffrey and the passengers prepared for some snorkeling. Masks and snorkels were handed out amongst the tourists, and once they were in the warm waters, Geoffrey and his colleagues joined them. He lowered his face into the water. They were swimming near a drop-off, where the shallow reef gave way to deep, dark, blue open ocean. The drop-off was a hive of activity, with parrotfish, wrasses, groupers, and sea turtles picking at the coral reef. The muffled sound of the underwater world added to the tranquility of the experience. But in an instant, that all changed. With no time to react and no warning, Geoffrey was suddenly struck by an enormous shark. Eyewitnesses estimate it to be about 6 meters long. Those above the surface of the water could just make out the dark shadow as it torpedoed directly for Geoffrey. There was no time to shout out, no time to warn him. The shark had appeared from the depths and was on him in seconds. One friend of Geoffrey's was Rod Plug. They both snorkeled near each other, not far from the boat. As they pointed out fish and dived underwater for closer looks, Rod's mask began to leak. He felt the water trickling in, tickling his cheeks as it made its way into the mask and began filling up. Rod took the mask off and wiped his face. He looked at Geoffrey. He was going to tell him he was going to sort his mask out, but Geoffrey's face was under the surface. Instead, Rod began to swim back to the boat. That was the last time he ever saw his friend. As he made his way towards the catamaran, he heard a splash and looked around. With its huge jaws opened wide and eyes rolled backwards, the enormous shark crunched down on Geoffrey. The sheer power from the hit and force from the bite severed Geoffrey's body in two. He was dead within seconds. The other snorkelers in the group saw the commotion in the water. When they lifted their faces above the surface, they were met with a sea of red, a bubbling, boiling of the water as the shark thrashed its head from side to side, biting Geoffrey in two. Horrified, they swam desperately for the boat. As fast as they could, they splashed through the water, their adrenaline surging and not daring to look back. Frantically, they reached the ladder and clambered out. Breathless and in shock, they watched as the shark submerged with half of Geoffrey's body in its mouth. There was nothing they could do. The crew made sure everyone else was accounted for. No one else was injured in the attack. Shaken and tearful, the passengers were terrified by what they had just witnessed. They weren't able to identify the species, but said that from above the water they could see that it was very dark on top and white on its underbelly. They said that it was massive, very long, and very wide. They estimated the dorsal fin to be about 1 meter high. Experts suspect the shark was either a great white or a tiger shark. One of the crew members radioed the authorities to report the devastating incident. Then, whilst the passengers were watching the water and the other half of Geoffrey's body bobbing up and down, one of the passengers screamed. The shark quietly re-emerged less than 10 minutes later. Only its snout and eyes protruded from the water's surface. This time it did not thrash around. It did not take a bite from the remains. Instead, it opened its huge jaws once more and grabbed hold of Geoffrey's body. Then, almost silently, it submerged once more, taking the rest of Geoffrey with it. There was a swirl in the water, and Geoffrey was gone. His death had been shockingly quick. Experts cautioned the estimates of the shark's great size, as water often distorts the size of things, but they admit that it must have been a huge shark to have bitten Geoffrey in half in one bite. The distressed passengers and crew decided to head straight to shore following the incident. They motored the boat directly into Geraldton and were taken in by emergency services and interviewed by police. Fisheries Officer Rory Macaulay from the Western Australia Fisheries Department assisted police and emergency responders in searching for the shark. If they found it, they planned to kill it and use it for the forensic investigation. They also hoped to find any remains of Geoffrey for the coroner's report. The search was started almost immediately. However, Policeman Sergeant Graham Clifford said that after hours of circling the area, nothing was found. The search was called off as the currents were strong and would have carried anything far into the open ocean. From what witnesses said, there sadly wasn't anything left of Geoffrey to find. No traces of the shark or Geoffrey were ever found. Officers alerted locals in the area to be aware of the dangers. There were rock lobster fishermen on the islands at the time of the attack who were notified of the tragedy, as well as other tourists visiting the area. Rory Macaulay, who worked as a shark research scientist, was asked to comment on the terrible attack and provide some insights into the behavior of the shark. He said there had been nothing to attract the shark to the snorkelers in the water. There was no food in the water and no fishing being carried out nearby. The edge of the continental shelf provides prey for sharks right on the fringes of their deep water habitat, but seeing great white sharks in the area was rare. They are known to swim up and down the western coast of Australia, but it is unusual for snorkelers to see them amongst the coral reefs. Geoffrey's father said that he and the family had received countless phone calls, letters, and cards of condolences in the days and weeks that followed the attack. His son was an incredibly popular young man whose carefree persona helped him to make friends with people from all walks of life. Although it may seem like shark attacks in Australian waters are common, they are, in fact, quite rare. There have been just over 1,000 attacks, with 236 of them being fatal since records began in the late 1700s. Even so, swimmers, snorkelers, and surfers know the risks every time they enter the water. This is shark habitat, and they are simply doing what comes naturally to them. Unfortunately for Geoffrey Brazie, what came naturally for the sharks that day resulted in his terrifying final affliction. The ancient ama divers of Japan have a history that stretches back 3,000 years. Back in the day, it was reserved for women only, but in the last 100 years, a few men have entered into this profession too. They dive for pearls, shellfish, and mussels. Even back then, the profession was one that was highly prized by the royals, and their tables were almost solely supplied by the ama if seafood was on the menu. The dedication, fitness, and skill that needed to be applied was of such a high standard that only the best of the best made it in the industry. It's said that the ama divers had the longest lifespans in all of Japan, and that's saying something coming from the country that boasts some of the highest life expectancy ages in the world. It's not uncommon to see 70-year-old ama divers who are every bit as active in the industry as their younger competitors. The divers traditionally wear white when they're in the water. This choice of clothing is made for very practical reasons. It deters sharks. When the predators are looking up from below, the white cloth is almost indistinguishable from the daylight sky above the water. That's also why most sea mammals have white bellies. It's the best camouflage that nature can provide. Besides their white tunics and loincloths, the ama divers wear nothing else. As recently as the 80s, most ama dove bare-chested, and keep in mind, most ama are women. There's a reason that they're called the mermaid divers. No scuba gear and no oxygen tanks. These are the original free divers, masters of their craft. Like his predecessors, Kazuto Harada could stay underwater for twice the length of time than the average human could. He and his two colleagues specialized in shell diving, especially the highly prized abalone that fetched the highest price at the docks. Even the American and European restaurants and the elite members of society sent their vessels over to Japan to get their hands on the rare delicacy. Kazuto and his 2 companions were some of the very few men who became ama. But then again, their mothers were all ama divers too. They were raised on the water, and it was only natural that they would follow in their parents' footsteps. Kazuto and his 2 companions, Akira and Ken, had their own fishing vessel equipped with modern radios and engines. They were some of the first ama divers to take a more modern approach to the occupation. Make no mistake, the skills needed to go down 30 feet with only the air that your lungs can hold were still every bit as old school as their ancestors honed. But the large, domed diving helmets and neoprene suits definitely made the icy water more bearable, and it allowed them to see more living treasures hidden amongst the crevices. The neoprene suits aren't the skin-tight diving suits we use today. They're much more loose-fitting and light, allowing for more mobility and weight. The fabric that soaks up the water, coupled with the weighted stones tied to their belts, helped the ama reach the bottom much faster and more smoothly. All 3 men were on edge. The last 2 weeks had news of shark sightings, and even 1 fatality in the area. Every time a fin was spotted, breaking the water, the radios would spread the news and location between the boats. None of the vessels were equipped with radar or the high-tech whistles and cogs we have today, so they relied on word of mouth to keep everyone in the loop. Word had spread that the great white that caused the fatality of another ama diver was at least 16 feet long, and the sightings after the attack was almost certainly the same shark. The morning was cold and overcast. Not that the temperature bothered the men all that much. They'd trained in freezing waters all of their lives, after all. Ken kept the radio within earshot as he fed the ropes tied to Kazuto and Akira down below. Every few minutes, one of the men would resurface with a bag full of crustaceans and shellfish. Ken then loaded the haul into their coolers before handing the empty bag back so that it could be filled all over again. So far, the morning had gone well. Their coolers were filling up nicely, and they would probably be able to go home earlier than usual, if they got half a dozen more good dives in. Akira exited the water and took over from Ken, while Ken got ready to enter the water to take the last shift. Kazuto wasn't quite done yet. At 41, he was the oldest in the group, but he was by far the most experienced, and he had the most stamina. He dumped his latest catch and took another breath, sinking down into the depths once again. From behind his fishbowl helmet, Kazuto could see the rocky bottom, covered in seaweed, and even from up high he could already spot the next clump of abalones suctioned on the side of a boulder. Their pearly blue shells sparkled merrily in the dim light from above. Kazuto's lungs were full, so he took his time pulling them off their anchored homes. But behind him, a predator had been lurking for the past hour. The very great white that had killed a female ama diver just a week before. Like it did with her, it observed the men first, staying just far enough so that they couldn't see it. It knew that it had exactly 2 minutes before the man resurfaced again. If it were going to strike, it needed to do it now, while he was alone. Kazuto's back was turned toward the deadly missile that torpedoed at him through the water, with his mind, hands, and eyes busy trying to pry the stubborn shells off the rock face. There was no way that he could have braced himself for the impact that was about to hit him. He was slammed into the rock in front of him so hard that he didn't even feel the teeth piercing his suit. His face struck the rock, cracking his screen and flooding the suit with water. The animal reared back, tearing the fabric and Kazuto's back to shreds as it went. Kazuto screamed into the salt water, the bubbles from his mouth rising silently to the surface. The shark began to swim toward the deep, with Kazuto held in its jaws, but the rope around Kazuto snapped tight, almost pulling it out of Akira's hands. The sudden resistance was enough to tear Kazuto free. Akira acted quickly when he felt the sudden jerk. He knew that Kazuto was being attacked by something down below. He didn't wait long enough to see the explosion of red bubbles breach the surface. He just dug his feet into the hull of the boat, pulling with all his might and screaming for Ken to help him. Together, they pulled their friend in. Kazuto surfaced, miraculously still alive and conscious, though he was leaving a trail of blood that turned the water red behind him as he was pulled toward the vessel. But their moment of relief was short-lived. Just as Ken reached out to grab Kazuto's already outstretched hand, the beast was back. Like some bizarre scene from Jaws, it sailed out from the deep and snatched Kazuto right in front of their eyes, bearing him back down into its aquatic playground. The men gripped the rope and started pulling again, but with one strong shake, the shark ripped Kazuto right out of his already shredded suit. The sudden lack of resistance sent Ken and Akira plowing backwards so far that they nearly landed in the sea themselves. Hoping that the animal just lost its grip, they reeled the rope in as fast as they could, but there was no weight to it at all. They knew, before the remains of Kazuto's ripped suit surfaced, that Kazuto wouldn't be inside it anymore. That tattered suit was all that they had to bring back to Kazuto's family. They never found his remains, but that didn't stop the shark from coming back. After 2 successful kills, it was now actively searching the shoreline for more ama. But the ama's willingness to embrace the new ways meant that the message was spread far and wide across the radio channels. Every single diver evacuated the water for 2 whole weeks, leaving the animal to search in vain until it finally became so hungry that it retreated back into the deep ocean to find food elsewhere. These 2 weeks weren't just effective at getting rid of the hunter. It also allowed the ama divers across Japan's shores, from the north to the south, to pay their respects to their fallen comrade. Kazuto's mother, who was still an active diver at the age of 71, and his sister, also a diver herself, received the remains of his suit and used it instead of his body to complete the appropriate funeral rites as best they could. It wasn't perfect, but it was all they had to bury. The only thing left of Kazuto Harada is the horrifying story of his terrifying final affliction.